Morning, everybody. And
Good afternoon.
I'm sorry. It was still morning an hour ago. Anyway,
That's right.
welcome. Thank you all for coming out to be with us today for the final meeting of CSRIC 6. We'll be hearing from two of the working groups today, Working Group 1 on transition to NG 911 and Working Group 3, and who will both have reports to present to you for a vote today. There's no status reports today because this is it. There's nothing to be statusy about. So we'll just have final reports today. So I'll just turn it over now to our chairman, Brian King, and thank you again.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I really want to start with a bunch of thank yous. Thank you for everyone who's participated in this council. It's been really, really great to be a part of, and thank you from me, especially for making it such an easy ride for me as chairman. So I really appreciate that, but I especially want to thank Mary Boyd from West for all of the great work that's gone on in Next Generation 911. Farouk Khatibi, who led up the reimagining of wireless emergency alerts, or just emergency alerts in general. Some fantastic work there, and really thinking ahead of what we can do from an industry point of view. And to Travis Russell, who's given us some great talks, I think, during these council meetings, and some, again, thinking ahead in terms of 5G, which is just around the corner for us, and a lot of other security factors that go into what we have ahead of us from an industry point of view. So really just for me, thank you very much, and I'll hand over to you if you have some few words.
I'll take
Okay.
Jeff's because he's
Yeah.
not using it until the end of the meeting. He doesn't have anything else to say. Good afternoon. See, I know it's afternoon. I welcome you to the FCC for the 8th and final meeting of the Communications Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council under its 6th charter. I would like to begin by thanking Brian King for his hard work and leadership over CSRIC for the past 2 years. Thank you so much. We all deeply appreciate Brian's guidance. I also want to thank Jeff Goldthorpe for his leadership as designated federal official of CSRIC. Today you will be hearing from Working Groups 1 and 2 as they present their final reports. Working Group 1 will present version 2.0 of their report on NG 911 best practices. Version 2.0 updates their June 2018 report on NG 911 best practices with additional best practices, including ways to improve NG 911 security. Working Group 3 will present their report on best practices and recommendations to mitigate security risks to current IP-based protocols. The report covers the domain name system and the border gateway protocol. I look forward to hearing both reports and council discussions that follow. Finally, I want to thank all of you for your commitment to CSRIC over these past 2 years. CSRIC's work is extremely valuable to the FCC and to our mission to help ensure that our nation's communications networks are secure, resilient, and fully operational. The issues are challenging and take a great deal of research, thought, and time to resolve. The diligence you have applied to this work has been very impressive. You have the FCC's sincerest gratitude. Thank you.
Thank you. So I guess before we start with the first of the presentations from Mary, let's quickly do roll call. Just to be efficient, I've kind of tagged everybody as you've sat down at the table, so I just want to shout out to folks on the phone, if we can try and be polite and not step all over each other as you announce yourself, and I'll try and check you off, so make sure we have quorum. So if you're out there, please announce.
Bob Gessner from the American Cable Association.
Susan Miller from Addis. Shelley Humphreys for Charlotte Field Charter Communications.
Dorothy Spears Dean with the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Farouk Katibi, Qualcomm.
Jay English with APCO.
Okay, I think missing a couple there, but I think we definitely have quorum there. So, so Mary, if you'd like to come up and come up to the podium, we have a clicker for you here. Oh, you have? Okay. Is Budge coming too?
Budge and I are connected at the, are you going to sit there and do that, or are you going
Oh, yeah, you're under orders, Budge.
I've got you tethered, Budge. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, Budge is going to join me in this presentation. He has led the task group one. You might remember we broke up into two task teams within Working Group 1, and so Budge has led this last initiative with all of our volunteers for working on the best practices. Okay, we're going to see if I can. Oh, okay, we're driving for me, thank you. So just a reminder, as the chief said, we were all about 911. This last initiative is focused on the best practices. You might recall in our report in June, we really were just at a point of not writing but reviewing. So today we have good news. We will not go through all the 211 that we amended. Mr. Chairman, you're
just 210.
210 and 40 brand new ones. So I want to recognize all the volunteers. We could not have worked on this the last 2 years without an incredibly dedicated team, a lot of talent on these calls, untold amount of conference calls that have been held, and then we also brought in additional subject matter experts that helped us along the way. So for the group of people on this slide, I cannot thank you enough. You are a wonderful team, and those who are on by either web or by bridge, I'd be honored to work with you again. I'm probably, who else is in this room that was on NREC 1? Am I the only one? I'm not that old, by the way. I was very young when I started, so this is quite an honor to go from the very first NREC to now CSRIC 6, so thank you all for this opportunity. On our next slide, am I driving? Okay, there we go. So the report, as I indicated, really is an amendment. As the chief said, it's version 2.0. We wanted to make sure we just modified and brought in the proposed amendments to the best practices. So I want to thank you for your support in June and also allowing us to take on this additional initiative related to best practices. So we had several deliverables. You see all the red on this slide. I am happy to say, since it's our last meeting, Mr. Chairman, and I will be clicking my heels, that we have completed all of our deliverables. We went in and evaluated the 1,000 best practices. We will give an overview of the amendments to the 1,016, where there were 213 existing best practices that we made some amendments to related to next generation 911 and public safety. Then we developed 40 new best practices that is now complete. Budge will cover those at a high level with you. And then the only final recommendation, and you'll hear me request in our motion for support, that we adopt with editorial privileges. We have been partnered with ADIS and the NRSC on this project. We got delayed with the shutdown in January. It cost us the month of partnership with them. We are still working with them. They have the list, and so we'll need to do some conformance to work within the system, so I'll ask you for editorial privileges and continue that work so we can get them in the system. And kudos to the entire ADIS staff who's worked with us. I think the 40 new ones were a test of the new system and how they would incorporate, so good job, guys. As I indicated to you, the existing best practices we really had to look at them and evaluate if there were any gaps related to next generation 911. We focused on monitoring, reliability, notification, and accountability that would aid in preventing 911 outages as we transition to an IP next generation 911 environment. We looked at the best practices on how they could facilitate if they needed to be updated to aid in this transition and protect our next generation 911 networks. There were 213 that we've made modifications. This is kind of an eye test for you on this slide. My apologies, just be thankful there's not 213 on there. These are just examples of what we did with the help of the commission staff, John Healy, bless him for being with us along the way as we worked in years and years of best practices. The existing ones were very minor modifications. We may have brought public safety into the best practice where they were absent prior to it. You might see that we included some minor tweaking. Configuration may include making changes to a VPC and MPC, but also establishing IP connectivity to border control functions. So as we looked at each one of them, we had a lot of engineers at the table on this for applicability to next generation 911. So for the commission, I think we're going to hand you a good set of best practices that really begins gets the country focused on next generation 911. So I'm going to ask Budge if he'll just give you the overview of 40 new ones. And where's John Healy? Is he in here?
No, he's not.
David? He's probably like, yippee, we have 40 new best practices. John is awesome. So we will work very hard to get these into the system. Budge is still going to help a couple of the other government folks so we don't leave this project hanging. So Budge, it's over to you.
All right, thank you, Mary. So what we've done on these next couple of slides, we went back and forth and we thought, well, do we actually put them up on the slide because we know they're not going to be very readable. But when you print this deck out, they're very readable. So this gives you a streamlined way to get to the 40 new ones without having to go look through a bunch of data, and we thought that was a big advantage. So what I'm going to do with these, the bold colors that you see on here is just to improve readability. There's no significance. The bold ones are not better than the unbolded ones. From here, Brian, can you read that? No, you probably can't.
Not a chance.
All right, so what I'm going to do for these, I'll pick out one or two and just read through them to give you a sense of what our focus was as we developed these 40 new ones. Obviously, they're all included in the report, and when you print the deck out like I have in front of me, you can actually read them. And those of you that are watching online, you can probably zoom in on your screen. So if you look at the last one on this particular screen, which is way down at the bottom, of this. I'll give you an example of what we've done. The bottom one reads, network operators, service providers, and public safety should be able to access logging data via a standard interface with proper authorization. So looking at this rich environment that's going to be available to us in Next Gen 911, it makes sense that logging data is available to those that are involved in the call handling, both from originating service provider ingress all the way to delivery at the PSAP. And that's kind of the spirit of what this best practice is all about. On the next slide, I'm going to go through them. I'll leave them up for a little while, and then I'll choose one to read off of each one. These are my favorites on the slide, not necessarily a representation of the group. So in the exact center there, there's a long one that reads, 911 network operators, service providers, and public safety should assess the impact on the routing and delivery of 911 calls and associated data to legacy and next-gen PSAPs associated with configuring their networks. This may include IP connections from NG 911 emergency services networks to NG 911 PSAPs, legacy selective router gateways and legacy PSAP gateways, SS7 supported trunk connections between legacy selective router gateways and legacy selective routers, and MF trunks from legacy PSAP gateways and legacy selective routers to legacy PSAPs. So The intent of that best practice is to encourage looking end-to-end at the call flow. You remember in the report we identified a number of demarcs in the diagrams. Several pages went through that process, and so this is just highlighting the importance of considering each of those demarc points and assessing the impact of routing and delivery as you transition from one demarc to another. We realize that each state and each PSAP, each region is probably going to have a slightly different implementation model. What we're doing in California is not necessarily the same thing that they're doing in other states. So this gives an opportunity to look at all those demarcs in the process. On the next slide, I'll highlight another one that's on this slide. It's the third from the bottom. Network operators, public safety, and service providers should identify and manage critical network elements and architecture that are essential for network connectivity and subscriber services, considering security, functional redundancy, and geographical diversity. So again, that gives you kind of a sense of what the group did. If you go through and read every single one of these 40 new best practices, you'll really get a sense of some of the things you need to consider, whether you're an originating service provider, a network or an NG911 service provider, myself as a 911 administrator, or even down to the PSAP level. It really helps you get an understanding of what's important in this next-gen 911 environment. On the next slide, I'm picking one off of each slide for us so I don't read 40 of them to you. I assume that would not be a good path. So on this one, the second one from the top, network operators, service providers, and public safety should establish and enforce policies that ensure cloud-based next-gen 911 services provide resilient performance and security that meet established best practices for public safety and 911 and that leverage the scalable and enhanced information technology capabilities of cloud-based next-gen 911 services. So you can see that we even tried to embrace some of the emerging technologies that are out there. There are some next-gen 911 service providers out there that are using cloud-based technologies, and so we wanted to make sure we included best practices that addressed everything that we could possibly imagine is going on in this space today. And on the final slide here that I'm going to cover, actually I think I have two more. The second one from the top reads, public safety should establish and document a process to plan, test, evaluate, and implement major change activities in a next-gen 911 environment to include NG911 implementations and other changes, new IP infrastructure, and NGCS. So this highlights the importance of a test environment in next-gen 911. Anytime you have an IP network, it's obviously important to make sure that they can work well with one another at the demarc points. Something we're doing in California, we're actually going to stand up a next-gen 911 lab to provide that opportunity for vendors all the way from CPE providers to next-gen 911 service providers to interact with one another in a lab environment. And we see this, the working group saw this as an important element in the rollout of next-gen 911. And then the final slide that I'll be briefing, the third from the bottom on this slide reads, originating service providers should route calls to the appropriate next-gen 911 next-generation core services based on the most accurate location information available. When location is unavailable, OSPs should default route calls according to their internal policy, such as an alternate call center. So this addresses some of the call routing features that need to be addressed in a next-gen 911 environment. So with that, those are some that I highlighted. I'm going to open it up to questions that anybody might have on any of the 40 new best practices. And I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks.
And then Mary's
So
got a few more to say, so go ahead.
I just wanted to make a comment. First of all, I really commend all of you for the work you've done, and I really appreciate the fact that you add some small carriers in the mix. We think that's really important. The one thing I would note, there are some of the provisions that came out in the new best practices that will be a little bit costly and potentially difficult for small carriers to actually implement. We appreciate the fact that some of this is aspirational, but I did want to note for the record that there will be some concerns for some of the smaller providers in terms of how, if it moves from aspirational should to must, will be a little bit more challenging.
Yeah, and that we had a lot of conversation around that. Each state obviously does things a little different. In California, we've met with all the small carriers. We know that's an important consideration, and so something that needs to be addressed as we move forward. That's some great feedback. Thank you.
We appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay, Mary, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Budge. And Shirley, I think in the Task Group 2 report, we recognize that there can be very expensive elements for the smaller rural carriers, and recommended that they collaborate with their 911 authorities as they transition. To Budge's point, every state is different. I know Dorothy Spears Dean is on by Bridge. Virginia has just gone through an extensive planning as well for the migration and heard similar concerns. So, I would just encourage the small rural carriers to really embrace working with those 911 authorities so they can work through the concerns and the cost, right, and help resolve that. So thank you for that feedback. Mr. Chairman, I have one final slide is our recommendations. The chief indicated part of the charter was about cybersecurity and security of next generation 911. Our work group did not have cybersecurity experts. We had a lot of 911 network experts on it, but not unique talents for cyber threats. So we have made a recommendation to the staff. Jeff and Suzanne and I have talked in future that the commission consider in future initiatives for CSRIC that we look at best practices for cyber and next generation 911. I know Jay English is also on by Bridge. Jay, well, some in this room, we worked with the TFOPA report for the commission, and there is a section on cyber in there. We did not write best practices, so I think the commission could get the talents they need to get that done, and come out with some really good best practices. So we make that recommendation to you, Mr. Chairman, and to the council. And then finally, as I indicated a little earlier, we would, in fact, if it's appropriate, I make a motion for adoption of this final report 2.0 for Working Group 1 that incorporates the best practices, but yet the council allow us editorial and conforming privileges to work with ADIS as they work to incorporate them. And certainly, John Healy's at the table with us for the commission staff. So I would offer that up if that's acceptable to the council. Thank you, sir, for the time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mary. So before we move to a vote there, I think just open it up on the phone, especially if there's other questions or other questions in the room, please indicate so. I'll give you a chance to find the mute key just in case. But yeah, Budge, very, very thorough. I think, the new best practices there. So thank you for that.
May I make a comment?
Yes. Is someone out there?
Yes, thank you. This is Robert Gessner, representing the American Cable Association. And I would just like to echo the concerns that small and mid-sized companies have with best practices as they start to move toward becoming required practices. I think many of our members, smaller members, provide very significant services in their communities, but they don't necessarily have the budgets and the manpower to undertake extensive capital investments there. So if that can be kept in mind, I don't know if the editorial privileges can extend so far as to make some changes in that regard to reflect that small operators need to have some consideration for the size of their markets and their abilities. So, thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Yeah, I know that was a concern from the outset when CSRIC was chartered, that we wanted to have good representation from smaller carriers. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, so with that, then we'll move to a vote to adopt the report as written with the editorial rights. So in the room, if you could just give the indication, say aye, and just put your hand up as well, please. So all those in favor?
Aye.
And on the phone, please.
Aye.
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 Okay, thank you. Okay, so next up we have Travis, fresh back from Barcelona.
I'm a little disappointed that we didn't have tapas here today, but Working Group 3, this last report is on DNS and BGP, and it was a great effort and a mad dash and sprint there towards the end. This is, of course, our last report. The charter asked for us to look at security risks to current IP-based protocols. That's a pretty broad topic that could include many different technologies. In fact, SIP was one of those considerations. SIP actually should have a study all of its own, and that'll probably take about 3 years to complete. But there's a lot of things going on with DNS and BGP, so I think it was very timely for us to put the focus on that. So just a little bit of an introduction. Our focus here was on the DNS network, and I'm going to give it a little bit of a background because, once a teacher, always a teacher. There's a lot of acronyms in here, so I've got just a few background slides to explain what exactly it is that we were looking at. But we were looking at the network as well as the technology that runs the domain name system, which is the Border Gateway Protocol, and the problems that we're seeing with that. Now, there are some new best practices and factors. Nist is introducing some best practices, has not been published yet, so we have not had the opportunity to review some of the latest best practices. I would certainly encourage everybody to look at that. Even though Nist is typically for federal networks, there's still great things that you can glean from their best practices. So, but we did not get to review that. Let's go to that one. All right. I thought I hit the wrong button. There we go. One of the things that we did first, because we're not the first to look at this, we looked at the work from CSRIC 3, Working Group 4, 5, and 7. And our approach here was to look at what gaps might exist between recommendations that were made by CSRIC 3 versus where we are today. And what have we seen change within the DNS? There's been quite a few changes, actually. So that was our focus. We did manage to squeak in some SMEs. We kind of ran out of time. We had more on the list, but the shutdown prevented us from getting more. But we did have Doug Montgomery from Nist and Tail Lawrence from Dyn, which is a DNS provider. But to our advantage, a lot of the working group members actually work for companies that have DNS services. So we had a lot of expertise here on this working group around DNS and the BGP protocol. So that helped us a bunch. So I promised a little background here. This is your primer on DNS and BGP. These are fundamental to making the internet run. So anytime you type in a URL, a Universal Resource Locator code, that can't be routed. It has to be changed into an IP address, and that is what the domain name system does. It takes that address that you type in your browser and changes that into an IP address that can then be routed. So DNS is that network that provides that capability, and then the Border Gateway Protocol is the technology that manages the routing of those queries through the DNS to retrieve these IP addresses. When DNS was first designed, the internet was still very, very small. It was in its infancy, so security really was not a concern. And so a lot of things that we see today are part of the design of DNS, their features, that now I think have to be reconsidered. Now, there was about 150 RFCs published by the Internet Engineering Task Force. And so these are their specifications, RFCs. The first one being published back in 1983. So it's an older system. There were some other routing protocols that were used previous to BGP. BGP actually replaced some of the earlier technologies back in 1989. So we know, it's used by everybody. BGP is that underlying technology. But I think one of the unique features in DNS is something that we call peer discovery. So when you connect a router, that router will advertise to all of its peers what networks it can reach automatically. In other protocols, like in 4G, the industry has said bad idea, because I can introduce a lot of false networks this way. I can falsify my routing records, and that then gets propagated throughout the internet, and that's exactly what we see happening today. So that's one of the issues that you're seeing going on, and I'll talk a little bit more about it. This is the only drawing I had time to put into the report. So you'll see here there's actually a hierarchical layer. So we start with what's called the root server. So I'm going to throw out a whole bunch of terminology now. Everybody who provides internet services has what's called the recursive server. So that recursive server's job is to go find an IP address through the DNS. And it will start by going to a root server someplace in the world. And that root server is going to look at that domain that you type in, .com, .edu, .gov. And there's a lower layer of servers responsible then for those domains. Once you reach those domains, those servers then will go to an authoritative server. The authoritative server then is the one that gives up the IP address. So that's where all of this routing has to happen. And that slide talks the same thing, so I'm trying to go fast before the snow accumulates. The other term I'll throw out there is anybody that owns IP addresses, they're known as autonomous systems. So you'll see in the report we talk a lot about autonomous systems as well. They're basically the owners of the IP ranges, and those are the networks that BGP connects and that DNS connects with. And that, quite frankly, is where we've seen most of the growth, is in all of these new networks popping in as autonomous networks. So the studies that were done by CSRIC 3, Working Group 4, they studied mostly on just general security within DNS. Working Group 5 focused on DNSSEC, and Working Group 7 focused on botnets, and in fact, they published what's still in existence today, the U.S. Anti-Botnet Code of Conduct. Some of the threats that they identified, attacks onto BGP sessions. So these are the sessions that get set up to exchange routing information between two routers. It's a major attack vector. And in that attack vector, we see session hijacking, which we see today still, as well as denial of service attacks. Session hijacking, quite simply, this is the interception of an IP address by corrupting routing tables, as I mentioned earlier. And then, of course, the denial of service attacks, they come in the way of botnets or just flooding a particular network. Botnets still are a problem. You've probably heard of the Mirai botnet. It attacked Dns network last year. I see variations of that botnet still attacking DNS today. One of the recommendations out of CSRIC 3 was to use the Internet Routing Registry. This is a repository, if you will, where everybody can put their routing, which networks they can reach. So that if you're going to be connecting into another service provider, you can go to that IRR and learn of what networks they can reach for the provisioning of your own network. It's very analogous to, in the wireless industry, we have something called IR21, where when networks connect to each other, they share all of their routing information and documentation, rather than doing this peer discovery mechanism. So that was one of the recommendations. There were several other recommendations to use some of the best current practices. I won't go through all of them. They're here in the report. These, I think, were the main ones, and there was a number of current practices that were defined then that are still applicable today. And this one also goes into all of those, so I won't go into that. There have been some developments since the last CSRIC. One of those developments, Nist, came out with a publication, 1814C. There were some recommendations there to use something that was called route origin validation. That, I think, still needs some review. The Internet Society, or the ISOC, they launched something called Manners, the mutually agreed norms for routing security. I'll define what that is in a little bit. And there's over 100 network providers that are participating in Manners today. And There is also the introduction of something that's called DNS over HTTPS and DNS over TLS. And I'm going to come back to those because there's some concerns around that. So DNS over TLS or DOT, this was introduced back in 2016. This basically is, it allows a network to use TLS to send a query from the recursive server or from the client to the recursive server, so it's encrypted and it can't be intercepted. TLS, of course, it's a well-known tunneling protocol, so should not be too much of an issue in implementing it, but that's only one method out of several. The other one that was introduced later in 2018 is something called DNS over HTTPS. This one could be a bit more problematic because it changes the way that we provide DNS services. Rather than have this hierarchical and distributed database as a service, DOH means that you could have a few third parties providing DNS services. So the client would choose where the recursive server would be. To put that into perspective, if you have an Android phone, your Android phone could choose to go to Google. I can't even pronounce that. This is what happens when I don't have enough tea. They could choose to use Google as their recursive server. Google and Android have a 75% market share. So rather than the decision being made by the network you're actually connected to, the decision as to which recursive server you go to goes by the application. And so it could and would make a major change in that ecosystem and could also introduce some performance issues. So this one still needs some more study, and definitely there needs to be some work on what is the impact to the network, what is the impact on security with that. Now, both of these introduce encryption, both through tunneling, either through HTTPS or TLS. And I already covered all of those. So we have seen some implementations of DNSSEC. Some operators have already implemented this. We've also seen some groups focusing on security, such as the IETF, the DNS OARC. This one, I don't understand this one. DNS inside baseball, and I mentioned earlier manners. So there have been some seeds planted to have a group that's focused on DNS, but there really is no association, if you will, that has that responsibility to look at and represent all DNS services. So I think that's another gap within the industry. I'm not going to go into a lot of description here about manners, but their job is to help provide tools, some best practices, some standardization for companies that do provide DNS-type services. And as I mentioned, there's already well over 100 network providers that are a part of this group. Some changes since Working Group 7. The U.S. Anti-Botnet Code of Conduct still is a valid report. However, again, DOH, DOT could have some implications and could impact even that, and so that still needs to have some evaluation. There's some current DNS threats, certainly, the ones that CSRIC 3 saw. We still see denial of service attacks. I mentioned this earlier. We still see denial of service attacks. And in fact, as we start to see IoT proliferate, I think we can count on seeing a lot more of these types of attacks affecting not only the enterprise, but also the DNS network. Spoof source addressing, this is where you're changing the source IP address in a packet and having all of the routing sent to that address, even though they never did send a query. That's another way of flooding, actually. And in incorrect routing injections, you've probably seen the news about how DNS traffic and internet traffic as a whole is suddenly being routed to another country. we actually see quite a bit of this happening on a regular basis. So I think that's one of the major concerns. So I won't go into amplification attacks, but that was another type of an attack that we saw. I'll go straight to the meat of the matter, our recommendations. So recommendation number one, if CSRIC decides to look at this further, there are some best practices that are being introduced. There is some work that is being done currently that we were not able to look at. And as I mentioned, the DOT and DOH, there needs to be some further studies on the effectiveness of those technologies and the impact of those technologies to make sure that those are well understood. We do believe network providers should implement the recommendations from the NSA cybersecurity report. This was a guide to border gateway protocol best practices that was released September 2018. We also recommend the implementation of route origin validation, or at least to look at ROV and work closely with Nist to finalize that specification to make sure that there's nothing onerous there for private sector. We also recommend that network operators that they participate and that they contribute with manners. I mentioned this Nist recommendation. It's still yet to be published. We recommend that stakeholders, they provide comments into that draft. Let's make sure that there's good content that comes out of that and that it's applicable not just to federal, but also to commercial enterprises and to service providers. They put out some great things. Their focus is usually federal systems, though, so we want to make sure that there's some things in reuse into the private sector. And as I mentioned, any future CSRIC working groups may want to consider the effects on security, on stability, and fragility of the internet when you start centralizing protocols, such as the case with DOH. There's been quite a bit around DNSSEC development. Our recommendation is that no further work be done at this time on DNSSEC in favor of driving more efforts around TLS or HTTPS. And in regards to DOT and DOH, again, there needs to be a lot more work done here, and there needs to be a lot more study done on the effects of both of these different approaches to make sure that we don't break something. We also recommend the use of the Internet Routing Registry, the IRR, and also using number resource certification. So anybody that is an operator of an autonomous system, or you own IP addresses, and you also lease out some of those IP addresses, certify the number resources that you own within your Internet registry. And that concludes our recommendations. So if you want to take it to a vote, and then I have one final thing.
Okay, thanks, Travis. Well, let's just open up for questions. I defy you to ask him a question that he cannot answer.
Don't.
So there's no questions in the room. What about you guys on the phone? So the only thing I have is, you mentioned SIP, and so is there further recommendation there that gets considered by future CSRIC?
Yeah, it needs to be pretty focused, though, because there's so much going on around SIP. I mean, you know, this would easily fall into nuisance calling and a bunch of other areas. But yeah, absolutely, especially as we start to see SIP as being incorporated more and more in networks, and we will see SIP in some shape or form in 5G as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, last chance for questions. All right, thanks, Travis. So let's put that up for a vote. So again, in the room, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
And on the phone, please.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
All right. And any against? Can we just check that on the phone? On the phone? Okay. Thank you, Travis.
All right, just one last thing. I would be remiss if I didn't say thanks to Working Group 3. You know, I always used to say, if you really want to learn something, try to teach it or write a report. This has been quite an educational experience even for me, but I just want to thank the working group. All of your professionalism, your dedication, all of the hard work was very, very key to getting this done. And special thanks to Addis for providing us some much-needed resources, such as the repository, and our email address was very, very key as well. So thank you, Susan. Thank you, Steve, for managing all of that. I appreciate it very much. And thank you to the FCC for tolerating me.
Thank you, Travis. Again, just another great talk. So maybe I'll tune in again when you're up there again doing some more talks. So thanks for that. I too would like to thank Addis, I think, for the great support that they've given to this CSRIC. Thanks to the staff from the FCC who've participated in all of the working groups. And Farouk, I didn't realize you were out there, but I know you got extra credit and finished early. But thank you to you as well for leading Working Group 2 there as well. So, and thanks in the room to Mary, Budge, and Travis. So thank you. And thank you, Jeff and Suzanne.
You're welcome. Thank you. Let me just say, as I do at the end of all these meetings, that I wanted to say a special thanks to all the people that aren't here, that are members of your working groups, and then we would just never be able to get this done without them. Obviously, not without you, Mary and Travis and Farouk, but it's rare that we see all the people behind your leadership, and so I wanted to thank them now. As been mentioned, this is the last meeting of CSRIC 6, and so keep your eyes open for public notice that may be coming out seeking nominations for the next CSRIC, which we expect will happen. So that's just something to be aware of. And for those of you that are wondering about the weather, the snow's not supposed to start here until 6, and the temperature at 6 is going to be 38 degrees. I'm not a meteorologist, but you know, I'm optimistic, okay? So I wish you all safe travels home, and until next time.
Thank you.
Farewell.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, the charter renewal was in the Federal Register today. The announcement of the renewal.